You are standing in the damp stillness of a half-collapsed villa on the outskirts of Rome. The date is June 9th, 68 AD. Dawn is just beginning to bleed into the mist, but the light barely reaches the corners of the room. The air is heavy with the sour stench of sweat, fear, and the faint metallic tang of blood yet to be spilled. From behind a warped wooden door, you hear a voice. Not the commanding bark of a general, not the measured tones of an emperor delivering judgment. It is high, cracked, desperate, the voice of a man begging the shadows not to close in. He repeats the same phrase over and over, his words trembling in the stale air, qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me. The speaker is Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, once master of the known world, a man who ordered cities burned for pleasure, a man who slaughtered family without hesitation, now reduced to hiding in the home of a freedman, unable to summon the courage to end his own life. This will not be the glorious death of a battlefield commander, nor the stoic exit of a Roman statesman. This will be a death so small, so shame-soaked, that even the scavengers of history will struggle to speak of it without contempt. But to understand how the fifth emperor of Rome reached this final, squalid hour, we must go back to the place where a teenage heir first tasted blood in the poisoned air of imperial power. December 1st, 37 AD. In the coastal town of Antium, the first light of winter morning stretches across the sea and spills into the chamber where a child takes his first breath. That breath carries the weight of centuries for Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, as he is first named, is born into a lineage steeped in both imperial grandeur and unrestrained brutality. His bloodline traces directly to Augustus, the founder of the empire, but it also runs dark with the memories of ruthless men and calculating women who carved their names into history with poison, steel, and calculated terror. His great-great-grandfather paraded through Gaul with severed heads swinging from the sides of his war elephant. His grandfather blinded a knight in the forum for daring to speak against him. His father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was so infamous for cruelty that when congratulated on the birth of his son, he replied without hesitation that nothing good could possibly come from the union of himself and Agrippina. The prophecy, unspoken yet already sealed in the blood of that newborn, would echo with grim accuracy through the years to come. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, is a figure both magnetic and deadly. Sister to Emperor Caligula, great-granddaughter of Augustus, she is the embodiment of imperial ambition sharpened into a weapon. She has already been exiled for conspiracy, has already buried a husband under clouds of suspicion, and now she turns all her energy toward the advancement of her son. When Lucius is only 3 years old, his father is dead. Some say by poison, others by disease. And whatever modest inheritance remains is seized by Caligula himself. Agrippina is banished to an island, and the boy is left with an aunt, a dancer, and a barber. Hardly the company in which to raise a future emperor. But Agrippina is not a woman who accepts exile as the closing chapter of her story. She waits, watches, and bides her time, knowing that in Rome, fortune's wheel never stops turning. Opportunity arrives in 41 AD, when Caligula is assassinated, and her uncle, Claudius, unexpectedly inherits the throne. Agrippina re-enters the city draped in calculated charm, securing a marriage to one of Rome's richest men, only for him to conveniently die and leave her his fortune. With wealth restored and position rising, she sets her sights on the greatest prize of all, the emperor himself. Claudius already has a wife, but when that woman, the notorious Messalina, humiliates him with a mock marriage to her lover, Agrippina steps in, offering not just herself, but the allure of political stability. Roman law forbids marriage between uncle and niece, but imperial power bends the law to its will, and in 49 AD, young Lucius watches his mother ascend to the position of empress. From that moment, his path to supreme power is paved in gold and blood. Agrippina engineers his adoption by Claudius, and his name is remade into Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. At 13, he takes on the toga of manhood. At 14, he is proclaimed heir to the throne, superseding Claudius's biological son Britannicus. At 15, he weds Octavia, Claudius's daughter, binding himself even deeper into the web of imperial legitimacy. But ambition, once awakened, does not rest. In October of 54 AD, Claudius dines on his favourite dish, mushrooms, and never rises from the table. The official story speaks of illness, but in the whispers that travel the marble corridors of the palace, everyone knows the truth. Agrippina has grown impatient. The meal is tainted, and when the poison fails to act quickly enough, a feather dipped in yet more toxin is forced down the emperor's throat under the guise of helping him vomit. Claudius dies in torment, his convulsions marking the end of one reign and the birth of another. At 17, Nero becomes emperor of the known world. In public, his first gestures are designed to charm: tax relief for the people, generosity to the masses, a public refusal to sign death warrants with the wistful declaration that he wished he had never learned to write. But beneath the polished surface, the seeds of suspicion and bloodlust have already taken root. Britannicus, the gentle and unassuming son of Claudius, becomes the first target. At a banquet, before the eyes of Rome's elite, he sips water cooled with ice that has been laced with poison. The convulsions are immediate, violent, and fatal. Nero, unmoved, assures the horrified guests that Britannicus is merely having an epileptic fit and orders the dinner to continue. The boy is dead within minutes. It is the first public crack in the facade, the first undeniable sign that beneath the fresh-faced youth seated on the throne beats the heart of a predator. For the first years of his reign, Nero moves like a falcon tethered to the wrist of its keeper, for three figures dominate the imperial court and hold his impulses in check: Agrippina, the mother who made him emperor; Seneca, the philosopher who believes he can guide the young ruler into statesmanship; and Burrus, the praetorian prefect whose authority over the imperial guard ensures that his counsel carries the weight of steel. Together they are called, in later histories, the good influences, a brief season in which Rome enjoys relative peace and stability. Yet Agrippina, intoxicated by her proximity to supreme power, is not content to remain the silent architect behind her son's throne. She demands to be consulted on all matters of state, insists on sitting beside Nero in public ceremonies, and even hints that her face should be stamped on Roman coinage alongside his. Her dominance in the public eye, her constant reminders that without her he would still be a provincial youth in the shadows, begin to breed resentment in the young emperor's mind. He is not content with the disciplined duties of governance. He hungers for chariot races, theatrical performances, and nights filled with whatever pleasures his position can command. Indulgences his mother dismisses as beneath the dignity of a Caesar. The wedge between them deepens when Nero's attention turns to a woman who is everything Agrippina is not. Poppaea Sabina, the wife of his friend Otho, is young, dazzling, and entirely unbound by moral restraint. She understands ambition as instinctively as a wolf understands the hunt, and she whispers to Nero that he will never be truly emperor while he remains under his mother's control. Agrippina senses the threat and reacts with the only weapon she has left: political menace. She begins to speak openly of Britannicus, hinting that perhaps she chose the wrong heir, and that Claudius's biological son would make a better emperor. It is a fatal miscalculation. In Nero's mind, his mother has shifted from an inconvenient presence to an existential danger, a rival whose influence could unmake him. But she is no ordinary enemy. She is beloved by the army, protected by her own guards, and has survived too many conspiracies to be brought down by simple poison. Killing her will require craft, precision, and an appearance of accident. Thus is born a plan so twisted it might have been lifted from the stage plays Nero adores. A ship is built with a special mechanism, a roof weighted with lead that can be collapsed without warning, crushing all beneath it. The stage for this performance will be the Bay of Baiae, under the pretense of honouring Agrippina with a place at a festival. On the night of March 23, 59 AD, the Empress Mother boards the vessel in high spirits, believing her son has finally come to his senses, reconciled their differences, and restored her to her rightful place beside him. She is accompanied by her friend Acerronia and a small retinue of servants. The night is calm, the water smooth, the air filled with the scent of salt and distant torches along the shore. Far from land, the signal is given, and the roof comes crashing down with a thunderous crack. But the careful stagecraft turns to chaos. Acerronia is killed instantly, but Agrippina is merely startled, bruised, and very much alive. In the confusion, she throws herself into the sea, swimming in the dark while oars and poles lash the water behind her. Weighted by her robes but driven by a will honed in decades of survival, she makes it to the shore, wet, furious, and now fully aware that her son has tried to kill her. When word reaches Nero that the plan has failed, panic seizes him. The pretense of accident is gone. Agrippina will waste no time rallying her allies, and within hours the city could turn against him. He calls for Anicetus, the very man who engineered the failed assassination, and orders him to finish what the sea could not. Under cover of darkness, a detachment of soldiers surrounds her villa. They find Agrippina still damp from her escape, issuing orders to her household, trying to gather her supporters. She does not plead when the soldiers burst into her chamber. She stands tall, her presence as formidable as it had been in the halls of power. With the cold clarity of a final gesture, she bares her body to them and says, "Strike my womb first, strike the place that bore such a monster." For a moment, the soldiers hesitate. This is the daughter of Germanicus, the mother of their emperor. But their orders are clear, and the blades fall, cutting down the most dangerous woman in Rome. By morning, the empire has no empress mother, and Nero is unshackled from the last restraint on his will. Yet the murder is not without consequence, for the whispers begin almost immediately that the emperor has committed matricide, the most abhorrent crime in Roman eyes, and the shadow of that sin will follow him to the final hours of his life. With Agrippina's body cooling in her villa, and the last of Nero's so-called good influences losing their grip on him, the emperor begins to taste power in its most intoxicating form. Unmediated, unchecked, and answerable to no authority but his own whims. For a brief period, the empire seems stable enough. Tax remissions and public entertainments keep the masses quiet, and the provinces have not yet begun to stir. But beneath the surface, the court is transforming into a theatre of personal indulgence. Poppaea Sabina, now fully in Nero's favour, becomes more than a mistress. She is an accomplice in shaping the empire into a stage for his ego. It is under her encouragement that the emperor moves from calculated political killings into murders performed almost as acts of artistic expression. Those who share blood with Augustus, those whose lineage carries even the faintest trace of imperial legitimacy, are dispatched one by one, not out of necessity, but because their very existence irritates Nero's sense of supremacy. To him, Rome is no longer a state to govern, but a cast of players in the ongoing drama of his own life. Octavia, his wife and Claudius's daughter, becomes the next casualty of his restless ambition. She is not accused of treason for any act she has committed, but for her failure to produce an heir, and for the unforgivable offence of standing between Nero and Poppaea. The charges against her are fabricated. Whispered tales of adultery with men of low rank, confessions wrenched out of tortured slaves whose screams echo through the palace corridors. But in the fevered air of imperial Rome, accusation and guilt are almost the same thing. When Nero announces his intention to replace her with Poppaea, the city erupts. Riots fill the streets, statues of Poppaea are torn down and dragged through filth, while images of Octavia are garlanded with flowers. For a moment, it seems the emperor might have to bend to the will of his people. Octavia is brought back to the palace, and Poppaea is moved to a villa outside the city. But this reprieve lasts only days. Poppaea convinces him that the unrest proves Octavia is conspiring against him, and soon the young empress is exiled to the barren island of Pandateria, the same place her grandmother had withered and died decades earlier. Exile is not enough. Within days, soldiers open her veins, letting her bleed slowly into the stones of her cell. She is 20 years old. Her severed head is sent to Poppaea as a gift, and 12 days later, Nero and Poppaea are married in a ceremony of dazzling excess that would have shamed even the most decadent of his predecessors. It is in this climate of boundless appetite and cruelty that the Great Fire comes. On the night of July 18th, 64 AD, flames ignite in the merchant stalls near the Circus Maximus. Whether sparked by accident or design, the city is tinder dry, the wind is strong, and within hours the fire becomes a living force, leaping from one crowded wooden structure to the next, swallowing entire neighborhoods. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome is an inferno. The screams of the trapped are lost beneath the roar of collapsing timbers and the steady thunder of the fire as it devours centuries of history. Thousands perish, more are left homeless, and the heart of the empire is reduced to ash. In the accounts that survive, Nero's actions during those days are contested. Some say he was away from the city and returned to direct relief efforts. Others, most damningly Tacitus, record that he climbed to a high vantage point and sang of Troy's destruction as the flames consumed his own capital. Whether the story is literal or not, it speaks to a truth about Nero's character. The suffering of his people is, to him, material for art, an opportunity to perform rather than a tragedy to be prevented. When the fire finally dies, the devastation is total. Of Rome's 14 districts, only 4 are untouched, the rest are rubble and cinder. The stench of burnt flesh mingles with the dust of collapsed buildings, and yet, while bodies are still being pulled from the ruins, Nero is walking the scorched ground with architects, sketching the outlines of a palace unlike anything the ancient world has seen. The Domus Aurea, the Golden House, will sprawl across nearly a third of the city, with revolving banquet halls, jewel-encrusted walls, and artificial lakes dug where neighborhoods once stood. To those who have lost everything, it is an obscenity. To Nero, it is the logical flowering of his reign, a personal monument built on the bones of his capital. Rumors spread that the fire was no accident, that the emperor himself ordered it to clear space for his dream. Whether true or not, the belief takes root in the public mind, and Nero, feeling the weight of their suspicion, seeks a scapegoat. The Christians, a small, misunderstood sect from the eastern provinces, are chosen. They are alien in their customs, vocal about an impending end of the world, and worship a man executed as a criminal. To most Romans, they are already strange and threatening. To Nero, they are perfect targets. What follows is less a judicial process than a sadistic spectacle. Christians are sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs in the arena, or nailed to crosses and left to die slowly in the sun. In Nero's private gardens, they are covered in pitch and set ablaze, human torches illuminating the emperor's evening entertainments while he mingles among guests and recites poetry. This is cruelty transformed into theatre, and for Nero, the suffering of others is not a necessary evil, but an aesthetic choice, as integral to his self-image as his lyre or his costume. By the mid-60s AD, the palace has become a gilded cage where Nero is both master and captive, adored by the flatterers who feed his ego, feared by those who know that the smallest displeasure can summon death, and cut off from the realities of the empire he governs. The treasury groans under the weight of his building projects and spectacles, but rather than turn his attention to the management of Rome's crises, Nero seeks an escape into the only arena where he feels truly alive: performance. That year, he announces an extended tour of Greece, not as a ruler attending to diplomatic affairs, but as a competitor in the sacred games. The Emperor of Rome will sing, act, race chariots, and recite poetry before Greek audiences, and in his mind the journey will be his artistic coronation. His participation is compulsory for the judges, for in every event Nero enters, the prize must go to him. It does not matter if he stumbles through his songs or, as at the Olympic Games, is thrown from his chariot and fails to finish the race. The victory is still his, justified by the claim that his intentions were too noble to go unrewarded. Over the course of the tour, he collects more than 1,800 first-place crowns, parading each one as if it were the spoils of a military conquest. Rome, meanwhile, watches this performance from afar with a mixture of embarrassment and resentment. While their emperor preens in foreign theatres, the capital suffers from the taxes and levies needed to fund his travels. The provinces grumble more loudly than ever, and in the far reaches of the empire, loyalty begins to erode. In Gaul, Gaius Julius Vindex raises the standard of revolt, declaring that Rome deserves a new emperor. In Spain, the seasoned General Galba gathers an army. Even in normally quiet Africa, the scent of unrest drifts on the wind. Nero, wrapped in the silks and laurels of his Greek triumphs, treats the news not as a mortal threat, but as material for grand revenge. He imagines public executions staged as moral dramas, rebel leaders humiliated in poetic tableaux. These fantasies fill his mind far more than any military strategy. For the theatre, not the battlefield, is the world in which he truly believes himself invincible. But the tempo of events quickens beyond the pace of his imagination. Reports grow darker and closer to home. Galba's forces advance. Governors turn their loyalty to the rebel cause, and the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, begin to make private arrangements with his enemies. The Senate, long cowed into silence, begins to whisper openly of alternatives to Nero's rule. Even the crowds, once willing to cheer for his spectacles, are restless. Their applause cooled into suspicion. The emperor, who has spent a lifetime believing that adoration is eternal, is unprepared for the speed with which devotion can dissolve. He does not summon legions or convene councils. Instead, he considers fleeing to Egypt, where he imagines a new life as an artist king, performing for audiences who will not judge him by Roman standards. To the soldiers and senators watching him, this is not vision but abdication, the instinct of a man who has always fled from the moment danger turns real. In June of 68 AD, the final break arrives with the quiet efficiency of inevitability. The Senate declares Nero a public enemy and sentences him to death by flogging, a punishment meant for the lowest criminals. The Praetorian Guard, seeing where fortune now lies, abandons him entirely. Courtiers vanish, friends turn their faces away, and even the slaves in the palace slip away into the city. For the first time in his reign, Nero is stripped of the stage, the audience, and the scripted power that has sustained his performance. Alone in the vast chambers of the palace, he drifts from room to room in disbelief, calling for Sporus to console him, the castrated boy still dressed in the trappings of an empress, the last grotesque ornament of a reign that has turned in upon itself. Outside the palace walls, the hoofbeats of history grow louder, carrying the rebels and their victory ever closer to the heart of Rome. On the night of June 8, 68 AD, the emperor who once commanded legions and set the tempo of Rome's life stands in the echoing emptiness of his palace, a man without allies, stripped of the aura that once made even his silence an object of fear. The corridors that had rung with the bustle of slaves and the murmurs of advisers are now hollow, and each step he takes through their marble length sounds like a reminder that he is walking through a mausoleum of his own reign. The Praetorian Guard, whose swords were supposed to defend him to the last, has vanished into the city's shadows. The Senate's decree hangs over him like an executioner's blade, death by flogging in the streets, the ultimate degradation for a man who still clings to the belief that he is an artist and a descendant of divine Augustus. He rages, he weeps, he calls for Sporus, the boy empress who remains as much a prisoner of Nero's ego as of the collapsing political order. And in that strange companionship there is a mirror of the emperor's own undoing, two lives shaped and destroyed by performance. When word comes that Galba's troops are entering Rome, panic becomes the only constant in his mind. At first, he imagines an escape as if plotting the third act of a play, a flight to the eastern provinces, where the Parthian king will welcome him as a fellow patron of the arts, where he will sing and perform for adoring foreign audiences, and where the sting of Roman rejection will be dulled by exotic luxury. But even in the planning, reality begins to intrude. No ships are waiting, no commanders pledge their loyalty, no one will follow him into exile. The fair weather friends have disappeared, the flatterers have turned their faces toward the rising sun of Galba's fortune. He is reduced to begging shelter from a freedman, Phaon, whose villa lies 4 miles outside the city. Under the cover of early dawn, Nero slips away from the palace, covering his face with a hood, his retinue reduced to a freedman, a secretary, a valet, and Sporus in his woman's robes. A grotesque parody of imperial dignity trudging through olive groves and byroads to avoid capture. The villa they reach is humble, its rooms plain, its air thick with the smell of earth rather than incense. Nero refuses to enter through the front, insisting on crawling through a hastily dug tunnel beneath the foundations, emerging into a cramped basement that becomes the last theatre of his life. Here, as the first light of June 9th filters through dusty windows, he receives the news that the Senate has not only condemned him but intends to parade him naked through the streets before beating him to death and casting his body into the Tiber. Each messenger brings word of further indignities. His own servants have begun looting his treasures, carrying off statues and costumes as spoils. The Praetorian Guard, once his shield, now hunts him for reward. The city that once cheered his every appearance dances at the rumor of his capture. Stripped of his illusions, Nero collapses to his knees on the dirt floor, sobbing not for the empire he has lost or the lives he has destroyed, but for his beautiful things. The costumes, the lyres, the props of the endless play in which he has been both director and star. It is Phaon and the others who speak the unspoken truth, that the choice remaining to him is not between life and death, but between the manner of his dying. They urge him to end his life by his own hand, to claim at least the final fragment of dignity Roman tradition allows to a fallen ruler. Yet Nero, who has ordered death for countless others, cannot bring himself to deliver it to himself. His hands, he says, are the hands of an artist, not a warrior. They were meant for creating beauty, not for violence. In this moment, his narcissism is distilled to its purest form. Even on the brink of obliteration, he imagines his role in history not as a tyrant brought low, but as a misunderstood genius cut down by lesser minds. Outside, hoofbeats draw nearer, the voices of soldiers calling to one another as they surround the villa. The time for reflection has ended, and still he hesitates, holding the dagger as though it were a venomous thing. Finally, with the enemy nearly at the door, his secretary Epaphroditus offers to help, but insists that Nero begin. Trembling, the emperor presses the blade to his throat, unable to summon the force to drive it deep. The door above crashes open, soldiers pouring into the rooms above, their armor ringing like the toll of a funeral bell. In those last moments, fear overwhelms even vanity, and with a convulsive movement he makes the shallowest of wounds. Epaphroditus, seeing the botched attempt, drives the steel home, severing the life of the man who had thought himself untouchable. As blood fills his throat and his breath rattles, Nero gasps his final words. Qualis artifex perio. What an artist dies in me, clinging even in death to the delusion that the world has lost a creator rather than being freed from a destroyer. Above them, the soldiers find the tunnel, descending with torches to illuminate a scene that will be recounted with mingled disgust and satisfaction for generations. The most powerful man on earth lying lifeless in a squalid basement, surrounded by the few who could not or would not abandon him, and the castrated boy who had been forced to live as his empress. When the news reaches Rome, the city erupts. not in mourning, but in unrestrained celebration. Flowers are placed on the statues of his victims, effigies of Nero are defaced, and people pour into the streets to mark the end of 14 years of fear. Across the empire, from Britain to Syria, spontaneous festivals rise like small bonfires of relief, and in the Senate his memory is damned by formal decree. Statues are melted, his name is chiselled from stone, the Domus Aurea is filled with concrete so that its golden halls will never again serve as a monument to imperial vanity. And yet, for all the erasures, his story cannot be excised from history. It remains as a warning, a portrait of the corrosion that comes when power is given without limit, and as a testament to the strange truth that some of history's most terrifying rulers end not in battle or martyrdom, but in a spectacle of cowardice so complete that it strips away even the veneer of greatness. The death of Nero was not simply the fall of a tyrant, it was the exposure of a fraud. For all his cruelty, all his posturing, all his insistence on his own genius, the end revealed him as something far smaller, a frightened man clinging to a few pretty objects, unable to face his own fate without another's hand to steady the blade. And in that final revelation, the pitiful truth of his life was laid bare, more stark and humiliating than even his enemies could have imagined.